My name's Sudith Devan. I am the business value lead for Australia and New Zealand here at AWS. So I guess a large part of my role is to help customers build their business cases to migrate to AWS. And my team works across our entire customer base, and we really help customers on this and coach them through this and work through building that business case for migration. So why business cases? And I guess, early in my career, business cases were very much seen as a bit of a necessary evil. I really did not like doing them. But then I guess as I matured and learnt more, you start to see they're a pretty important document for justifying a major project. And cloud migration is no different. But as I started to work with customers and you start to see how customers are using business cases, very quickly you start to realize that business cases are in fact a really strong baseline. And they're a baseline for understanding a future economic value of a project based on a set of assumptions or data points. And then also, perhaps more importantly, understanding how that future economic value will change if those data points or those assumptions turn out to be a little bit different from what you first imagined. So really important for establishing that baseline. So what we're going to do today, we're going to cover three things. So one is we're going to go through a framework that we use with our customers every day to help them quantify and understand where the sources of value are when you're moving to AWS. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to go through a customer example of a customer that's actually been able to derive value from AWS across that cloud value framework. And then finally, we're going to go through some of the resources that we have available to you to get you started on the journey to migrate and build that business case to migrate to AWS. So just sort of going through why customers migrate to AWS, there's heaps of reasons. And some of them are on the screen there, and I'm sure you can think of many other reasons. And when we start speaking to customers and when my team gets engaged, a lot of the customers think about cost savings. And cost savings is usually the first step. But when you start talking to customers and you start to understand their drivers and why they're really interested in their stories, you realize that cost savings is just the start. And then you start thinking about innovation, you start thinking about developer productivity, you start thinking about data center consolidation, you start seeing that there's a lot more to the customer story than there is cost savings. So listening to our customer stories, we're able to distill all these sort of reasons that customers have to migrate into what we call the cloud value framework. And the cloud value framework sets up 4 pillars that most of the reasons that you'll migrate to AWS will fit under one of those 4 pillars. So I'm just going to step you through those 4 pillars for the moment. So one is around cost savings, perhaps not really a surprise, and that's the first reason a lot of customers do think about moving to AWS. The next one is staff productivity, and this is some of the benefits that you might get from AWS that at various areas of your staff, and we'll go through an example of that a bit later. The next is around operational resilience and the benefits that you get from a high availability infrastructure that AWS provides. And finally, it's around agility and innovation, and this is bringing that speed and automation into your business through the AWS platform. So if you look across the cloud value framework, at one side, it's a very cost impact focused equation, and you're all talking about bottom line savings here. But as you move from left to right across the cloud value framework, you start getting around business impact and business value, and you start seeing that it's not just about the bottom line, and you start seeing some good top line impacts as you move across that value framework. So now we're just going to go through each of the 4 different pillars just to illustrate these a little bit further and talk through how you could potentially build them into your business case. So just putting your mind into when you're doing your planning for your IT infrastructure. You've got infrastructure costs on the vertical axes and you've got time on the horizontal axes. At some point you're going to do some level of demand forecasting, and a demand forecast might look something like this. You might be a bit more clever than just doing it as a straight line, but for simplicity's sake, let's assume you forecast over a period of time, I'm going to need this much IT infrastructure. In an on-premise environment, you're going to make some sort of capital investments over time to meet that demand. You could be doing one capital investment a year, you could be doing several, but for argument's sake, let's think of that as a step function of some sort. When you go to use your IT infrastructure in an on-premise world, you know that your usage is quite variable. It's not a straight line, it's not a step function, and you're going to have this up and down variance throughout the course of the year. This gives you two problems. So one, you get an opportunity cost, and this is where your usage hasn't quite hit your demand. You've actually overinvested for that period of time. You could have done something better with that money, potentially, but instead you're stuck with unutilized IT equipment. On the flip side, you get this lost opportunity, and this is where the opposite happens. This is where you might have this unexpected project or a sudden customer demand or a surge of demand from your customers, and you haven't got the capacity to do that. You've got to wait. You might have to put a project on hold for another financial year. It's a very common scenario that our customers face who are on-premises environments. And this kind of phenomena happens regardless of how efficiently you manage on-premise. This is just something inherent with running on-premise, and it's not the fault of people who are running these environments. So I guess the economics of AWS and moving to cloud is all about getting that supply and demand line as close as possible. So you're starting to see that elimination of wastage, and you're trying to make sure that we get those supply and demand lines as close as possible so that you can continue to use the platform for the demand that you need and for that unexpected demand when it comes through. So there are a number of ways that AWS takes this concept and applies it to help you reduce cost. The first is around our pricing models, and we'll go through these in a second, but we've got 3 different pricing models to suit your different workloads. The second is around giving you levers to remove wastage and making sure that you pay only for what you need. The third is around proactive price reductions. So AWS has a culture of doing proactive price reductions, and we've done 72 price reductions since our inception in 2006. And finally, as you grow, you're going to get more access to tiered volume and pricing discounts and various things. So as you grow, it becomes cheaper to sort of do business with AWS. So 3 and 4 up there are things that you'll get as a result of being on AWS. But the first 2 are sort of techniques and skills that you can use to actually get the most out of the platform. And I'm going to talk you through these techniques. So we call them levers, and the first lever is around picking the right pricing model. We've got 3 different pricing models, as I mentioned before: on-demand, reserved instances, and spot. On-demand is your sort of classic cloud computing where you're paying by the hour, by the minute, and in fact we bill a lot of on-demand services by the second. And you've got no commitment to us beyond that time period. So very flexible, no commit type of model. Reserved instances, you do commit for 1 or 3 years, but in exchange for that commitment, we give you a pretty substantial discount. In the case of a 3-year reserved instances, discounts can be up to 65% versus on-demand. So it is pretty substantial for that commitment. And finally, you have spot. And spot is a much more of a dynamic pricing model. We set pricing on a pretty dynamic basis based on historical supply and demand. And you can bid for that capacity based on what you need. And it is much more dynamic. You can get significantly higher discounts versus on-demand, but of course, we reserve the right to change the prices within a 2-hour window. So the way you use that is very dependent on your particular workload. The next lever we have around cost savings is a concept called right-sizing. And right-sizing is all about understanding your utilization and making sure that you only utilize you only provision on AWS what in fact you're actually utilizing. So as an example, if you've got a 4 vCPU, 16 gigabyte of RAM machine running on premise, if you weren't going to right size this and weren't going to think about utilization, this would be what's called in AWS terms is a C5.x large, which is on demand. It's a 22 cents per hour instance. A typical utilization is around that 40-50% based on what statistics we've seen globally. So if you were to apply that to that 4 vCPU, 16 gigabyte of RAM virtual machine, that would straight away map to a C5.large, and you'd save 50% of your bill just by doing that. So utilization is an important part to make sure that you understand, and when you're building your business cases, use that utilization as a way to control that cost on AWS. The third lever is a concept called elasticity. Elasticity, to put it quite simply, is just turning your instances off when you're not using it. And a classic example of elasticity and benefiting from elasticity is test dev. A lot of our customers run test dev servers 100% of the time, even though they only use that during office hours. And if you actually use AWS for test dev and you're turning servers when turning them off when you're not using them, you can get some significant discounts by simply not paying for them when they're not on. You can get a lot more sophisticated with elasticity. We have tools like Autoscale where you can set rules to provision when your capacity scales up and scales down. And then we also have a service called AWS Lambda, which is our serverless computing, and you only actually pay for your resources when the code is running and no other costs. So again, all workload dependent and application dependent. I'm not suggesting you can do this for every single application, but it's definitely something to consider when you're building your business case. So when you actually flow this through, all these three levers are quite compounding in the way that they sort of stack up and add value. So let's just assume that you've migrated to AWS, you've put everything on demand, and you haven't used any other lever. So let's just assume that's about 100% from pricing. If you move all this to 3-year reserved instances, as an example, you can drop the price by up to 60% straight away just by doing that. If you right size, we've seen customers get another 10 to 20% on top of that. And then finally, when you bring in that elasticity as well, you can get another 10 to 20% saving from that as well. So overall, compared to doing no application of the commercial levers to applying them all, a lot of our customers have gained up to a 70% optimization, so to speak, of how they actually use AWS. So that's cost savings. Let's sort of move on to staff productivity, the next lever, the next pillar in the cloud value framework. Last year we did some benchmarking across about 500 customers globally, both commercial and public sector, around the benefits they've received for staff productivity by moving onto AWS. They told us that on average their staff was able to manage double the amount of virtual machines or EC2 instances and double the amount of storage on AWS compared to when they were on premise. And that was largely driven by the automation available in the AWS platform and a lot of tasks now not being needed to be done now that you're on AWS. And we'll come back to that in a second. Perhaps the most interesting thing was customers that had been on AWS for 3 years or longer were able to actually triple the benefit compared to customers that were on AWS for less than a year. On 1 to 2 years. And the reason for that is staff productivity on AWS is something that you get better at over time. You start learning more services, you start learning more features, you become more confident, and you can start to apply these. And you do see customers go through this learning curve and benefit in the long run when they move on to AWS. So let's get a bit more specific and look at a typical server administrator type work. So as a server administrator, customers have told us that software changes, they've been able to reduce the time doing software changes by up to 50%. And that's largely due to the automation, but it's also due to the fact that a lot of the software changes are now restricted to the application layer, and everything up to the operating system layer is now part of the AWS service or the EC2 service. Hardware purchasing, again due to automation, has reduced by up to 75%, and that's what our customers are actually telling us, that that whole process of provisioning new hardware on AWS is significantly cheaper. The final one, which is pretty much eliminated by moving to AWS, is hardware failure. This is now an AWS problem once you move over to AWS, and we manage that for you. And it's not something that you, as your staff, needs to actually dedicate to from a hardware failure perspective. So you can have some pretty substantial benefits, and when you actually build your business case, we encourage you to look at your staff, look at the tasks that they're doing, and then work with us to identify what are the potential savings on those different activities, and almost do it from the bottom up, because it makes a substantial difference to the business case. But of course, when you actually run on AWS, it makes a substantial difference to your business. Just sort of moving through on operational resilience, reverting back to that benchmarking work that we did, we saw that customers had told us they had a 43% reduction in monthly incidents as a result of moving to AWS. There were three reasons behind this. So one was around the infrastructure availability that AWS provides, and using techniques such as multi-availability zone failover and architecting towards high availability, and that's something that we help our customers with all the time. The second is through using tools such as AWS CloudFormation, which actually automates and standardizes how you configure your resources and manage your resources, or even a tool like AWS Identity Access Manager, which centralizes how you manage your users and their credentials. So again, reduces that opportunity for error from that perspective. And then finally, from a security perspective, AWS has over 30 security certifications, ISO, PCI DSS, and IRAP as well. So customers use those certifications and get those benefits. And we know operational resilience, when you think about it from a business case perspective, it can be a bit tricky to quantify, but we also know there's a number of studies that show the material impact of unplanned downtime. We've seen that from a number of different sources, and I'm just going to pop a few up there: IDC, Poneman Institute, etc., that have quantified unplanned outages and the impact of these to large organizations. So when you're doing your business case, a lot of our customers, you do find that they do quantify, they do track the impact of unplanned outages, and you can look at some of those risk reduction factors of moving to AWS and perhaps quantify that and include that in your business case. So now sort of moving on to the last pillar, which is around agility and innovation. And it's something that we use quite a bit, and we're told by our customers it's often the one that is the hardest to quantify, but the one that they can get most excited about. And the way I think about agility and innovation, or business agility in a more sort of broader sense, is on three aspects. So one is, it's the agility in your ability to experiment. How do you experiment faster, and how do you experiment in smaller chunks without putting out a whole amount of money for servers or other types of equipment? Do that in much smaller chunks. The second aspect is, how do you control the cost of failure? And with AWS, because you're not experimenting with big chunks of money, if something fails, you can certainly retire that spend straight away and return that back to the business. The final piece is, how do you scale so fast and control the cost of scaling? So with AWS, you can scale quickly, you can scale into multi-regions, and you can scale quite quickly through the AWS services that we have and through the architectures that we can help build you. So just sort of moving through agility and how that applies to software development. So just to make it a bit more real. So this is a typical software development lifecycle. And we can see that we have about 6 stages and the percentages of time split across those different aspects. So with AWS, if we look through each of those different stages, the different benefits that we have. So at that early stage, AWS really helps you simplify the requirements design. And we have an example of doing this is we have a number of different reference architectures. We have pre-built solutions that you can leverage in your solutions going forward and save a lot of time from that perspective. This could be something as simple as auto-scaling, and a lot of our customers use our auto-scale in a pre-packaged way. But it could be something as complex as an IoT device manager. So you don't need to start from scratch in every AWS deployment. From a build, integrate, and test, we have seen customers dramatically increase the speed at which they do this. And what they say to us is that AWS actually helps them de-risk architecture decisions, which sounds a little counterintuitive to actually build, integrate, and test. But what we see is customers find it a lot more nimble to just try an architecture rather than debating it, documenting in various formats, and getting all sorts of approval. They can quickly try that architecture, test it. If it doesn't work, shut it down, move on to the next thing, and use those learnings and results to inform the next decision. So we see that with customers all the time. AWS also helps reduce the deployment wait time. So what that particularly means, a lot of our customers use a service called AWS Code Deploy, which really helps customers speed up moving code from dev test into production and standardize how that's actually done. And finally, we know AWS reduces the maintenance cost quite significantly, and we've sort of talked about that at length today. So just sort of moving through just do a case study in a real customer that we've had in the APAC region. I'm just going to sort of go to the Philippines for the moment, and this is Globe Telecom. And Globe is a large telecom provider, has over 65 million customers in the Philippines. They're also quite a big user of AWS, over 2,600 EC2 instances and 7 petabytes of storage. Just across that cloud value framework, 30% TCO savings, 15 times increase in app performance, and that was through using AWS Connect, and I know there's another talk on AWS Connect a bit later on this morning. They've also used a 99.99% uptime, as well as cutting their provisioning time dramatically through using AWS. So quite significant benefits over that cloud value framework. So just sort of moving on to the final part of the presentation, how can AWS help you build your business case? So we have a 4-stage analysis approach. So one is, and that's what my team actually does. So when you engage your account manager to engage the cloud economics team, we'll set up a first call with you just to understand your business drivers, who your stakeholders are, and what you're trying to understand out of moving to AWS. Then we'll go through a data gathering phase, and data gathering is by far the longest stage in this process, and the stage that can cause a lot of stall, because it is always hard to get that full data set of what you're trying to migrate. Some customers do it better than others, and we also have some techniques that we can help you with, and I'll show you that quite shortly. The next stage is around analysis, and this is where we take that data and we start to understand what this could look like on AWS and start to quantify your business case for you and work through that with you. And finally, we have the executive presentation, and this is where we can present something with you, we can present something for you, we can do it on our paper, we can do it on your paper, and build out that final presentation to your executives so that you're armed with the right details to make a case to migrate to AWS. So just in terms of getting started, I said that data gathering and discovery is the hardest stage. We acquired a company last December called TSO Logic, and I know there's been a couple of customers in our public sector segment that have used TSO Logic already, and I'll just play a short video now just to demonstrate how TSO Logic could work for your particular environment.
Remove the guesswork from planning your migration to AWS. TSO Logic's powerful platform ingests millions of real-time data points about your organization's environment, then provides accurate data-driven recommendations for right-sizing and right-costing workloads on AWS. Here is how TSO Logic can help you plan your migration with confidence and unlock significant cost savings. TSO Logic's platform communicates with data gathering and discovery tools that are common within most enterprises. Using the industry's most accurate data-driven algorithmic analysis, you can accelerate the planning process. Replace manual discovery and guesswork with real-time data and automation. We identify your compute, storage, and current cost of ownership. We then create a statistical model of capabilities, processor types, and utilization. Our algorithms select the best AWS instance, along with costs. Multiple scenarios for comparison can be created based on parameters you set, such as payment type and location. The platform then direct matches and right-sizes your workloads for AWS. By identifying your optimal instances, eliminate wasteful over-provisioning. And by leveraging the elasticity of AWS, you can save in excess of 30%. Your scenarios can create a multi-year business case, factoring in migration costs, discounts, and other assumptions. Then you can compare with your current costs to see the return on investment. Discover how TSO Logic can help plan and measure your migration to AWS with confidence and unlock significant cost savings.
As I said, part of the AWS family now, and that's a free tool available to our customers to use through your account manager or through your AWS partner. So other resources that we have for you, sorry, I'm just going to click through that. Other resources that we have for you to get started. So we have a TCO calculator online. We have the Cloud Economics Center, which gives you access to lots of different case studies and research. And then we also have some value realization studies, again, through your account manager that sort of goes through some of the benefits our customers have had. So just to wrap up, key learnings today. So one is the AWS business case is your baseline, and it's super important to establish that baseline, and we really encourage our customers to do that. The cloud and moving to AWS is a commercial transition. So you are moving away from paying for what you have to paying for what you need. And we really want to make sure that our customers pay for what they need. And then finally, there's more to the business case than just cost savings. And that cloud value framework is a really good framework to get you started to identify the value beyond the cost savings. So with that, thank you again for your time this morning. I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit, and looking forward to working with you going forward. Cheers.